Hi, I'm Samir Jain, summarizing a very interesting conversation that I came across by two prominent Indian economists, Subramaniam and Rajan. It's on the state of the Indian economy. So I don't follow India personally or invest in it, but this was a great conversation. And these are not my views, these are their views, but I did make copious notes, and here are my takeaways. So it seems that markets are optimistic, but ordinary Indians are pessimistic. There's been a secular weakness in market reform over the past decade. COVID, of course, hasn't helped at all over the last 2 years. And what is most striking, according to them, is there has been an aborted transformation of the Indian economy over the last 10 years, ever since the global financial crisis. And the most pressing need of the hour is to revive what they say is private investments and to revive it in labor intensive exports. Think of something like garment industry as an example. They also point out that there is much that is defective in policy making. So this begs the question, why are markets optimistic? Well, markets are optimistic because the stock markets have done exceedingly well. They've boomed over the last year. And the counter to this is the stock market is not reflective of the overall economy. It could very well be that emerging markets' hot money has been fleeing China to come to India. And in fact, we see this in the fact that large companies have done much better during the pandemic than smaller companies. So it could very well be that this is just fleeting money that's come into the stock market that's buoyed it up, because certainly the small and medium enterprise sector has performed abysmally. The good news is the rating agencies have now put India's outlook as stable. So that's provided some reassurance to the market. Foreign direct investments, FDIs, are surging almost 6 billion a month. But the question is, how much of this FDI is really being channeled to greenfield new projects that will create new jobs, that will add to the economy, that at the margin will contribute, versus foreigners just buying stakes in existing Indian firms, which is really just a transfer of economic ownership. It's good, but it really doesn't add too much to the national economy. Then there's been this rise of unicorns, Digitex, almost 100 private companies, and these companies' valuations really don't have too much sanctity, for many at least, but these are valued at $300 billion. The question is, how much of this is funded by foreign dollars, or how much of it is domestic Indian ownership? That still isn't very clear. Exports seem to be doing fine, and there is this expectation of the COVID bounce back. The good news is vaccinations are on track. This has been a phenomenal exercise. Almost 1 billion Indians are vaccinated, not completely, but at least one dose. And the government has had a very active reform agenda. They've been talking about privatization for a long time, but privatization is happening, and the Air India example is one. They've also come out with a new asset monetization policy, and there's a rich pipeline to assets that are intended to be monetized. They've come up with a new industrial policy, and the stress has been in the Modi government, make in India. There have been some labor reform, and there have been some very good developments for quite some time actually, under a very dynamic union minister in infrastructure, in roads, in networks. The Modi government has stressed what it calls, or maybe not it, someone else calls it, it's called new welfareism. Essentially, the BJP, the ruling government, has delivered essential services, and these are things like toilets, bank accounts, electricity, cooking gas. They've implemented direct bank transfers to poor people to their bank accounts, and because a lot of India is still unbanked, and now they're delivering potable water to rural homes through pipes. So this has been huge. But critics say that despite all of this welfareism, we saw a complete breakdown in the welfare state during the pandemic. And in fact, it is true, many households have slipped into poverty because India doesn't have that social safety net. So overall, redistributions are good when they come from growth, but growth only comes when there is a surplus, and there is no surplus today. And which is probably why when the RBI did a consumer confidence survey, the finding was overall Indians are very pessimistic, and there are multiple reasons. Some are things like we see a return of reservation politics. There are lots of differences between the center, the federal center, and the states on how sales tax revenue is to be shared. There is this new movement that started once again. It was there around 20-30 years ago to reserve jobs for locals. And there's been a lot of agitation in the agricultural sector, particularly in India's grain and food basket in the Punjab. So lots of people feel that there's been a loss of overall economic dynamism, and this has resulted in aborted structural transformation, or at least transformation that should have happened, but it has not happened over the last decade post the global financial crisis. So many critical metrics, objective metrics, haven't improved. And a lot of these are soft metrics on which you rate a company's competitiveness, the ease of doing business, inspections, a general reduction in tariffs, how the court process plays out, the bankruptcy court that was to be formed, those rules that they haven't taken on, new capacity hasn't been created. Overall, an improvement in institutions, for those of us who believe that institutions are paramount to ameliorating people from poverty, a lot of the basic soft aspects of development haven't improved. And in fact, there are a lot of deep contradictions, policy contradictions. For example, the government has been talking of export-led growth, but then at the same time, they have also increased a lot of input tariffs. There's some criticism that foreign investors, we haven't really rolled out the red carpet for them. And how do you really increase service exports? Most countries are moving from manufacturing to service. So, for example, in order to be a viable service player, you need to beef up your data security framework. And for those who say that, hey, we should talk about replacing export demand with domestic demand, the question is, where will this domestic demand really come from? After all, fixed asset investments will only happen if the land acquisition process improves. Industrial capacity utilization, that's very low, so that needs to rise. The other thing is, how will middle income groups participate in consumption? And you really can't rely on government to fuel a lot of investment and consumption, because the debt to GDP ratio is already pretty high, 90% or more. And revenues in a number of states have reduced. So the takeaway is, overall things are in control, but growth dynamism has stalled. And the economy has certainly slowed down over the last many years. The data on investments, on exports, on imports, on credit, all of this seems to be suggesting a secular decline. And there are many other indicators such as child health, stunting, And a lot of government actions actually, despite demonetization, the share of cash in the economy, which was really the intent behind it to remove this black money, is back. In fact, it's increased to around 15% of the GDP, very high number. COVID has had a very bad impact with almost 70% infections. People, and the statistics are pretty pathetic, but people estimate that the real mortality rate is far higher than government numbers. It could be as high as 2.5 to 5 million. So all of this has exacerbated poverty. All of this has reduced per capita consumption. Some school surveys show that an entire generation of kids have lost out on a year and a half of schooling. So, what are the real reasons behind this aborted structural transformation? Their words, not mine. Why did it happen? So, it really depends on who you're listening to. And many people say that a lot of it has its basis in the global financial services crisis, 2008 2009 crisis, something that I've mapped separately in a book that's available on Amazon. But India has slipped a lot more than the peer group, and a lot of this has to do with history. The previous government to the BJP, in its second term, the UPA government, was plagued with macro mismanagement, corruption, decision making paralysis. And after the BJP came to power, during the first term they did pretty well, but during the second term, some of their actions, such as I said, demonetization, that wasn't implemented well. The way GST, the sales tax new regime that they brought in, that wasn't implemented well. Initially, the way COVID was handled. And there are lots of allegations, with some merit, that decision making has been centralized. Then there's this failure in managing the twin balance sheet problems that India has always struggled with, which is really bad banks and very weak, highly indebted firms. All of this has created non-performing assets in banks, not now, but for many, many years. So there's risky debts. There are these companies that have become very debt heavy and that have been financed by a very weak public sector banking system. So these are the issues that absolutely need to be fixed. And a panacea is to begin with having good data. We have very bad data on GDP, on actual consumption, on unemployment, on COVID mortalities. And the second is a burgeoning resentment that decisions are not fair. And the term being bandied about is stigmatized capitalization, that government is in cahoots with a few business houses, and they call them the two A's, the Ambanis and the Adanis. The third thing is a somewhat of a breakdown in statecraft. There's a trust deficit that has crept up between states and the center. And this has come around, not so much around politics, but really around how revenue is shared, how resources are being allocated to manage COVID. And then, of course, there are more specific structural issues, including issues around agriculture. And there's this perception that, well, there is growth. A lot of this growth is really not inclusive growth. There's a lot of talk about policy inconsistency in the way the export sector is being restructured, in inconsistencies that a bankruptcy code that was promulgated with high fanfare really never took off. And this results in a lot of metrics that have been flat. I don't really have the numbers in front of me, but a lot of metrics, the tax to GDP ratio, that has been static. They've kept raising tax exemption thresholds, that has reduced the number of people within the net tax bracket. So the feeling is, while the economy is out of the ICU, COVID is still not completely under control, but there is a more basic need to restore structural transformation, to revive exports, to improve self-reliance, to implement this new industrial policy. And there've been certain new things that have come in, performance-linked price subsidies. People see that as a positive, but then the negative is a return to protectionism, trade barriers being enacted. Also, a lot of geopolitics now plays its part with the rise of China. So to contain China, India has kept out of regional trade agreements. And that's really not a good thing, because when you do that, you also stay away of dynamic Asian markets, Asian supply chains, and whenever there is protectionism, it's going to be extremely hard to exit that. And the reason why I say there is protectionism is a number of import taxes have been raised. And when you raise import taxes, that translates into exports becoming more expensive as those factor inputs are passed on. And while, as I said, there may be good reasons for staying out of trade, regional trade agreements, geopolitics with respect to China, but it's really not a good idea to stay excluded from these very, very strong Asian markets that the world covets, to bring resilience also in the supply chain. And there is this criticism that India has attracted less than 15-16% of the export space that has been vacated by China, as China has become more and more expensive in labor costs. There have been some good initiatives to create a bad bank that would absorb the non-performing assets, that would address the twin balance sheet problems. But very little has been done really on the ground to ensure that all of these contribute to improve the investment climate. But as I said, there have been some good developments. Something recently that's happened is a reversal in the retroactive Taxation Act, which was pretty egregious. The telecom sector has been opened up. There have been a number of new reforms. But there's also been a lot of criticism that it's been really two big firms that have now benefited, and these firms are becoming bigger and bigger, and that has led to a concentration of power, that has led to a concentration of these big firms in just two sectors. So there are lots of pros and cons. And if you're really looking at over the last decade, it depends on whose perspective you listen to. Non-performing assets have gone up. Governance hasn't improved. There have been a lot of stresses in the SME sector. There are two big business houses. We really don't know if they become more effective. But they've certainly had a much, much more profitable run during the pandemic. They've had a lot more growth. They've had a lot more concentration in petroleum, in textiles, telecom, retail, even education, media, energy, as well as many, many other sectors. Now, some people are sort of drawing a parallel between these and the Korean conglomerates, the Chaebols. But we must not forget that those conglomerates had to pass an export test to be competitive, while a lot of these Indian firms that are being treated with kid gloves are in very favored regulatory sectors. So it's difficult to know if these are really efficient. And it's even more difficult to know whether by nurturing them, would it really have spillovers in the real economy? And if you read the trade press, there are lots of examples that certain companies, like for example, Vodafone in the telecom sector has been kept out. Amazon hasn't been able to crack the retail sector. Certain industries such as man-made fibers, tariffs have gone up to protect Reliance Industries, and the fallout of that has been as I said earlier, the intensive labor-intensive garment sector hasn't taken off. So a lot of these regulatory favors, and of course there's no real clear evidence, but there's very strong rhetoric that all of these have sort of concentrated benefits. But overall, things such as infrastructure, direct benefit transfers, employment guarantees, much needed during the pandemic, improvement in the public distribution system, setting up a unified payment interface, increasing roads and rail networks, all of these have certainly shown marked improvements. But as I said earlier, there's a lot of lacuna, and that lacuna is, for example, in the data that we get, data integrity, the access and perception that a lot of these decisions are not fair, that the playing field is not normal, the lack of trust between the center and the states, including the BJP-led states actually, and an absence of participatory decision making. All of these have sort of weakened institutions, and there's been some policy inconsistency. And if the foreign press is to be believed, critics talk a lot about social disharmony, about politics that has resulted in authoritarianism, where the Prime Minister's office holds enormous power, and this is creating this perception that there's a centralization of funds at the federal level, which they use as a lever against the states. There's also been some enforcement agencies that have completely gone over the top, tax agencies that have pushed forward certain agendas against certain people, the use of the Central Bureau of Investigation, some allegations, and these are just allegations perhaps, that government has been keeping tabs on people, which people say, at least the liberals say, that all of this has curtailed free speech, that space has shrunk, and when you curtail free speech, you really dampen the marketplace for ideas. So cronyism, as I alluded to, for two business houses, that has created concentration. There's some issues of electoral funding, and lastly, to conclude, the government has been accused of majoritarianism, the Hindu majority really catering on religious grounds, the actions that they've taken in Kashmir, suspending Article 370, all of these have created bad international press, and they have exacerbated intra-country, intra-group divisions within the country, and these are really things that the government has been accused of promoting a divisive agenda, which creates bad press, it creates a bad perception of the country, and it certainly leads to political, economic, and social instability, all of which depresses investment and is ultimately not good for the economy. So here was a lot of content. I do not necessarily personally agree with a lot of it, but certainly all of these are grounds for thought. So I thought that I would take notes, internalize it, and also share it with those of you who may have an interest in in following India. And I'll conclude by saying that while some of these criticisms make sense, there's very little evidence that this majoritarianism has led in any way to the government allocating greater amounts of public welfare to majorities and ostracizing the minorities. So a lot of this is also rhetoric. So take a lot of what I've said with a pinch of salt too, because India is a very nuanced, complex country. Thank you so much for listening in. Bye bye.